Hey, I'm Nate. I'm a college student studying computer science, and I want to make video games. Today I'm making the second game in the 20 games challenge, which is Jetpack Joyrider. For this second level of the challenge, there's the choice between two games, Brick Breaker and Jetpack Joyride. Now, I know Brick Breaker would have been the more obvious choice after having made Pong. I mean, it's practically just single-player Pong turned on its side, but I wanted to take on more of a challenge, especially scripting-wise because of my background in programming, since this game uses stuff like spawners, saving, and of course, the titular machine gun jetpack. And that's where I began with this project. I started out by creating a simple jump, and then from there I decided the way I'd go about creating the bullets would be through instantiation. Now, I know I probably could have achieved the effect with particles, but after messing around with particle emitters for a bit, I decided that it would just be easier for me if I made the bullets via scripting. Now, one thing you can see I was struggling with was trying to control the rate at which the bullets were instantiated. I spent quite a while trying to fix this, almost 30 minutes, because I was way overthinking my solutions. Shockingly, it turns out the best solution is often the easiest, and in this case, that was just creating a single variable that would tick down to 0 before resetting, and then every time it hit 0, a bullet would be created. Pretty simple. So I'm a big note taker. I find taking notes is a great way for me to be organized, and going into projects like these, I always take some sort of notes, however little. In this case, I used my notes as sort of a checklist of things to implement in the game, so when I got around to making obstacles, I already knew what kinds I would make. Now, I could have kept the obstacles all pretty simple if I wanted to, but I guess I just love making things overly complicated for myself because I decided I'd make a missile object that would track the player's position and home in on it, as well as a grunt object, which I ended up deciding you'd have to shoot in order to get points rather than just scoring based off of time or distance. I felt like doing it this way would encourage a different and more aggressive kind of playstyle. So the next part I began working on after making all those obstacles was of course creating the spawner for all those obstacles. Now, I've created spawners like this in projects before, but normally those would handle a singular item at like varying heights. This one was different because it had to take into account 5 different objects. So I had to figure out some sort of way to mix up which object it chose to create. The solution I eventually came to was using random numbers. Essentially, every few seconds, a new random number would be generated, and depending on what range it fell within determined which object was created. I had the most basic objects, the flat and tall blocks, spawn the most, while the wall with a gap in it would spawn the least, and then each one had a range along the y-axis that it could randomly spawn upon. Now, obviously I left the grunt object out of this random spawn, as having your source of points spawn via chance is not very, fun. So instead, what I decided upon was having the grunt spawn at fixed intervals, so the player would always have the opportunity to score points. At this point in the time-lapse, you can see I began work on a game manager, which would handle everything from restarting the game whenever the player died to displaying the UI. And I'm going to be honest with you, I just straight ripped this script from an older project of mine, because, you know, why retype the same code if I've already written it? And this ends up saving me a lot of time. I ended up creating the entire death and restart mechanic of this game in a little over 10 minutes, which I think is pretty fast for me, so. So here you can see I finally go back to the spawner to implement the grunts, which there you can see at first I had it spawning every frame, which is not good. I ended up fixing that. I stick it on a timer and have them end up spawning every 1.5 to 2 seconds. So after finally getting the grunts implemented, I had to create a special behavior for them so that whenever they came into contact with an object that had the tag bullet on them, which obviously is just the bullets, they would end up destroying themselves. And while destroying themselves, they would also send out a function at first to the game manager, which I found out didn't really work that well, but essentially what I was trying to do was have the game manager keep track of the score, and whenever the grunt would die, it would tick up that score. But for some reason that wasn't working, so I ended up just skipping the game manager altogether and just have it straight up update the score, go straight to the score script and update from there. After that, I began to implement a save manager because I wanted to create a high score system that would remember your score in between both dying and even completely restarting the game altogether. Once again, I stole the bones of this system from another project. However, in that project, I had 3 variables that I was saving, whereas in this one, I only had the 1 to save, so it's pretty simple and straightforward to implement, and pretty quick too, since I already knew the gist of how to do it. The way the save manager works is that anytime there was a change in the game state, whether that be a death, restart, or even just a new high score being achieved, it would take the high score in the game, write it out to a file outside of the game, and then upon opening or reloading the game, it would take the high score from that file and set it as the new high score in the game. And with that done and made, I essentially had a finished game. However, you might have noticed a distinct lack of missiles, which I had discussed at the very beginning of this video. That's because I decided to save the implementation of the missile for the very end, since I knew it would likely be the hardest thing to make in this game, and based off the remaining runtime of this video, you can see it also took far longer than any other component of this game. My initial idea was to use the vector3.lerp function, which I had discovered working on Pong in the last video. What I had hoped was that by using interpolation, I could have the rocket smoothly move towards the player up to a certain point, and then after that, just move straight left off the screen. The issue was that the function was not working the way I had hoped, and was creating a far jankier missile than I wanted. So with that idea tossed out, it was off to Google to find a better solution. Thanks to a few blog posts I found and an amazing Brackeys tutorial, which I'll link below in the description, I managed to find a way to create a homing missile in just a few lines of code, which I'm going to go ahead and walk through now. First, you want to find the direction the missile has to travel. This is achieved by taking the target's vector and subtracting it by the missile's vector. What this will give you is the resultant vector, or in our case, the direction of travel. If this graph seems familiar to you, that's because this resultant vector formula is actually related to Pythagorean's theorem, which I think is pretty cool. How exactly, I'm not entirely sure, but it's something I'm still learning myself. Next, you want to normalize that direction of travel. Thankfully, Unity has a function for doing that, so not much to do here, it's pretty easy. After that, we find the degree of rotation. This is found by taking the cross product of the direction and the y-axis, or the upwards direction. This result will lie along the z-axis, which is perpendicular to both the directional axis and the y-axis. And what this will tell us is how much the missile should turn to face its target. Finally, we add acceleration and boom, you've got a homing missile. Of course, all of that is way easier said than done. In the end, this section of the game development process took well over an hour and a half. There was a lot that I was trying to learn in such a short amount of time, and I ended up overlooking a ton of stuff that came back later to cause a lot of headache and bugs. But eventually, I got there in the end, and it worked. The missile was finally in the game. And so, with the missile finally added, the game was complete. This project was a ton of fun, especially in terms of scripting. I just loved the feeling of programming in something and finally getting it to work the way you intended. It's like solving a puzzle that you also created for yourself. It's immensely satisfying. Anyways, I really enjoyed this game and I'm looking forward to the next one. Maybe then I'll finally add some art outside of a few boxes.